Hey there, friends. Good to be back with you again this week, and I want to get right into it. I want to this whole business that we've been talking about over the last 7 or 8 weeks about quit going to church. It sounds really bad. I get that, but I want it to sound bad. I want it to be something that shocks us into making some decisions about our own lives that would be more reflective of the lordship of Christ and the greatness of God. And one of the most foundational moves that we can make has to do with if we want to quit going to church, we need to quit trying to be something or someone we're not. So bear with me. This will make a little bit of sense today, I think. One of the greatest stories in the Bible starts nearly at the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, where we see that God calls Abram, who would be later be named Abraham, calls him into this great world-changing, history-changing covenant where God makes some promises to Abraham and calls on him to make promises back to him. And there's such value in Old Testament stories, and frankly, this one almost begins it all for us. So I'm not going to read the whole story. It would take a while, but it's in chapter 12 of Genesis. And I just want to read a couple of verses at the beginning, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." That's the essence of the covenant, where God makes promises to Abram. He calls on Abram to make promises back to him. God told Abram to leave his home, to leave his people, to leave his household, to leave everything that was familiar, everything that was safe, everything that he had built up. And God made him huge promises that he would make him, out of him and his family, a great nation, and all people, all humanity would be blessed through him. What an amazing promise. So Abraham left, and he took with him his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot and all of their children and all their possessions and all the people that were part of his extended family and his workforce and everything, and everything that he had acquired over years of living in this place called Haran. And he set out for Canaan, the promised land. We read that when he arrived there, we read that he had been doing everything God had required of him. He had been doing everything he was supposed to do. He had left his father's house. He had trusted God. He had believed in God's words and the promises. He had gone on this adventure without even knowing where he was going, let alone how it was going to happen or how it was going to unfold. I remember the night that years ago, 27, 28 years ago, when the Farah family left their land. We left California and headed to Texas. And Texas has been referred to as the promised land by many people. But we got in our truck and we headed, and I will tell you, we were scared. We didn't know what we were going to encounter. We left everything behind that was familiar, that was safe. And I remember us being out in the desert, coming across that first night, and just Wanda and I looking at each other in silence with this look like, God, we're trusting you. We're trusting that this move that we are making is the right one. I remember it as if it were yesterday. Can't even begin to equate with what God had called Abram to do. But it's where this gets personal for me. It was what God called Abram to do was beyond impossible. Abram didn't have any idea what the future would bring. But he did it anyway. And when he arrived in the land, the story in chapter 12, and you'd have to read through it to see this, but one of the things that Abram did is he built altars. He built them in at least a couple of places. Certainly he built them in other places because that was where he could and would worship his God publicly. And I would say this, Abraham was on his way to living out his happily ever after. At least it seems that way when I read the story. But as is usually the case, his life and his faith and his trust in God was put to the test almost immediately. The land that would be his, where he would have his roots and belong, well, it didn't produce any food. It didn't produce crops. And as the story goes in chapter 12 and really beyond, there was a famine, and life became more and more and more difficult to live than he ever expected. I think Abram thought that, man, everything is going to be great. But just, it's like it always does. Things go south. And as we read the story in chapter 12, and I really do encourage you to read it on your own, in those moments, in those days where the dream just started to go down the toilet because of the famine in the land, there is no record of Abram asking God for help. There is no record of him turning back to God. The test came. The famine came. He should have sought guidance. He should have been on his knees. He should have been trusting God. But instead, what he did is that he used his own best judgment and left for Egypt. This was where God told him to go. This is where God promised that he would take care of him. And out of fear, Abraham took matters into his own hands and went this way to Egypt. Gosh, is this story like us or what? And as he went to Egypt and arrived in Egypt, he proceeded to do everything wrong. He acted directly opposite of God's plans. Again, does that sound familiar? I'm not going to tell you this whole story, but he threatened his future family, the nation that would come from him. He did all of that by having his wife taken from him to live in the house of another man. On a lie, no less, that he himself, Abram, created. Here, take Sarah. Take my wife. Maybe we will receive the king's favor, and maybe maybe this can work out to our benefit. Go. Instead, it ends up bringing dishonor. Dishonor to his own name, rather than seeing his own name being made great as God intended. At the end of chapter 12, when you read it, you can almost hear the disgust in King Pharaoh's voice when he says to Abram, go on, just get out of here. I don't want to be around you anymore. When the secrets came to light. Yeah, his name wasn't given any worth or value anymore. It was given dishonor because of his deception, because of this plan that he came up with on his own. And instead of being a blessing to other people, he ends up bringing plagues and curses on the house of Pharaoh. Everything was the exact opposite of what the Lord had promised in his life. But somewhere in their interaction, and we don't see it, we just have to kind of picture it between the lines. God says, I'm going to make the story right again. Trust me, Abram, I'm going to keep my end of the bargain, even though you didn't. Because nothing is too big for God. And what we read in just a few short lines, God led him back. He led Abram and his family and his extended family, all of them. He led them back to the land he never should have left in the first place, and continued the story. So here's what I want you to get today. In the first 2 or 3 verses of chapter 13, we see this story really begin to unfold. It says this: So Abram went from Egypt to the Negev, which is where he left to go to Egypt, with his wife and everything he had, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. In the story, as it's written in chapter 12, it says that Abram had gone to these places and built an altar to worship God, where he could put an animal on the altar and the fragrance of the animal would go up, and the worship of the Almighty would happen right there. This story teaches us so much about our history, about our heritage, the family tree of God's people that we are connected to. Generation upon generation upon generation, dating all the way back to Abram. And to me, this part of the story in chapter 12 and 13 of Genesis, it's the story about our need to be reminded of earlier promises, earlier moments in our lives that we need to be brought back to really continually. It's in the value of altars. Now, I could tell you about altars. These things that sit in front of me right now are small altars in my life. Each one of them has meaning. Each one of them takes me back to a place in time, a moment in time, a story in my life where God has proven himself faithful to me. I don't need to tell you those stories. They They're mine. They're my altars. And I've got lots of them. Lots of them. If you were to wander in my office behind me, not everything back here is an altar, but there are altars that have been made. Symbolic reminders in my life where I can go back and I can remember what God has done. They're around me. What do you do when you realize that you have moved out of obedience and into sin and disobedience? What do you do when, after days or weeks or months or years of walking side by side with your God and your guide, you decide to walk away and begin to do things on your own? What do you do? What do you do when you've blown it? What do you do when you've wandered away? What do you do when you've turned your back on the promises of God? Well, here's what you do. It might be hard, but it really isn't complicated at all. You do what Abram did. You retrace your steps. You go back. You don't ignore the sin. You don't ignore the situation or your surroundings. But you come to grips with the reality of what you are doing, the mess that you have created, and you stare it down. There's no other way around it. But you don't stay there. Yeah, you run. You flee. You leave the area. You get out of the chaos that you have made for yourself. You leave it behind. But you don't just go wandering. You let God lead you back to where the promises were made. Back to where God was on the throne and where you believed He was worthy of your trust. You go back to an altar where the memorial was made, where the promise was made, where the covenant was signed. I can go back to 1971. I can go back to 1998. I can go back to 1999. These two are very close. I can go back to 1985. I can choose whichever one I want to. I can go back to when I was 7 years old and I was baptized. I have memorials all throughout my life that I can pick and choose and go back and remember what happened. It's important to realize that Abram didn't become an awesome, towering man of faith overnight. When he arrived in the land of promise, he failed miserably the first test, and he took off to Egypt. And it took some time for him to learn to trust God as he ought to. His faith, just like our faith, often comes in stages. He didn't understand everything all at once. And I think as those of us who inherit the promises of Abraham, we who are blessed because of his ultimate faithfulness to his end of the bargain, but more so to God's faithfulness to keeping up his end, we shouldn't be surprised when the same is true for us. We will fail. We will get lost. We'll get confused. We will choose poorly and give in to unwise thinking or bad judgment. We will. It happens. We may even reject God's love and guidance for a season. But the great thing about this is that you can always go back. Abram returned to where he had once walked well with God. You can too. Right now, just in this moment. Let's go back to an altar. Let's go back to a memorial. Let's go back to that place a couple of thousand years ago where Jesus told his followers, his disciples, to take the bread and take the juice. Remember what Jesus had done. And more importantly, remember his promise for what he will do in our future. Until next time, see ya.
Your love is like radiant diamonds bursting inside us, we cannot contain. Your love will surely come find us like blazing wildfire, singing your name. God of mercy, sweet love of mine, I have surrendered.